I feel like I'm on top of the world.
Hey, Jack, I feel like I'm flying.
You want to take it from the story, just so we all know where we are? All right.
You've seen Titanic more times than you can count. You know every line, every heartbreak, every moment that made you cry at 2 in the morning. But here's what nobody told you. This film is hiding something in almost every scene, and once you see it, you genuinely cannot go back. We're not talking about tiny, forgivable little slips that only film students notice. We're talking about moments that made it into one of the highest-grossing movies in Hollywood history. Moments that the entire editing team watched over and over again and somehow still missed. James Cameron spent over $200 million making this film. He rebuilt the Titanic. He obsessed over every single detail. And yet, hiding in plain sight throughout this masterpiece are bloopers, historical mistakes, and continuity errors so obvious they'll make your jaw drop. So sit back, because by the time we're done here, you're going to watch Titanic in a completely different way. Let's start with something that happens during one of the most intense sequences in the entire film. When the ship is flooding and chaos is taking over every corridor, Rose is sprinting through the lower decks trying to survive. She comes across a fire emergency box mounted on the wall, and behind a small pane of glass sits an axe. She smashes the glass, grabs the axe, and runs. The scene is fast, emotional, and brilliantly shot. But here's where it gets interesting. If you go back and watch those few seconds very carefully, you'll notice that in the shot immediately after she breaks the glass, a significant portion of that same pane appears completely intact again. Not cracked, not hanging by a thread, fully unbroken, sitting right there in the frame like nothing ever happened to it. There's no explanation, no additional sound of breaking, and no cutaway that would justify the glass restoring itself. It just reappears. On a film with this level of scrutiny and this kind of budget, it's genuinely surprising that nobody caught it before the final cut went out to theaters around the world. Now stay in that same sequence, because the very next moment hands us another blooper that's somehow even more noticeable. Jack is handcuffed to a pipe in a flooding room, and Rose swings that same axe down to break the chain and free him. It's one of the most gripping moments in the film. But take a slow look at the axe itself as it makes contact. The head of the axe visibly bends. It wobbles and flops in a way that a real steel axe never would, because it wasn't a real steel axe at all. It was made of rubber, which is completely standard practice for safety on film sets where actors are in close proximity to swinging props. The problem is that it was never supposed to be that obvious. For just a fraction of a second, this life-saving tool looks more like something you'd find in a joke shop than in a dramatic survival sequence. The rubber gives it away completely, and once your eye catches that wobble, the tension of the scene takes a brief but very noticeable hit. And while we're looking closely at Jack during that handcuff scene, there's a wardrobe detail that's going to make you look twice. Before Rose swings the axe, Jack is clearly wearing his suspenders over his shirt. You can see them in the shots leading up to the moment of impact. But in the specific shot where the cuff actually breaks, those suspenders have completely vanished. And then, just like that, in the very next shot, they are back again. The reason for this is that the close-up action shot was filmed using a stunt performer standing in for Leonardo DiCaprio, and somewhere in the process of setting up that shot, the costume team forgot to add the suspenders to the stunt double's outfit. It's the kind of error that happens on busy sets with dozens of moving parts, but it's also the kind of thing that a thorough continuity check during editing should have caught. The suspenders disappearing and reappearing in the span of a few seconds is a detail that, once noticed, is genuinely hard to stop seeing every single time you watch that scene. Moving away from that sequence, there's a blooper involving the flooding of the ship itself that demonstrates just how chaotic large-scale production can get. During the scenes where water is crashing through the windows of the ship, there's a specific set of 4 windows that you'll want to pay attention to. In one shot, you can watch the water burst through the first window, then the second, then the third, and finally the fourth. But in another shot from what appears to be the same moment in the same location, the order is different. The water comes through the first, then the second, then jumps to the fourth before finally going through the third. The sequence of the shattering doesn't match between the 2 shots. What happened here is that the scene was filmed multiple times across different takes, and when the editors were assembling the final cut, they chose the most visually dramatic shots from different takes without fully accounting for the fact that the order of the window breaks didn't line up. It doesn't change the story one bit, but it's a clear sign of how these massive action sequences are built from pieces of many different attempts rather than one continuous capture. Here's one that requires a very sharp eye, but once you find it, it becomes one of the most talked about bloopers in the film. There's a scene where Jack steps into the upper class section of the ship for the first time. It's a significant character moment, and the camera follows his perspective as he walks through elegant doors and takes in the world he's never been part of before. If you pause and look carefully at the glass in one of those doors as the camera moves through, you'll catch a reflection that absolutely should not be there. A figure with camera equipment is visible in the glass. It's not ambiguous or blurry. It's a genuine reflection of a crew member behind the camera, caught in the polished surface of the door. This kind of thing happens fairly regularly on sets that use real reflective surfaces, but in a film of this prestige and scale, it's the sort of detail you'd expect to be caught and corrected in post-production. Instead, it made it into the final film, giving audiences a brief, unintentional behind-the-scenes glimpse right in the middle of a pivotal scene. Now let's shift from physical bloopers to something a little more layered. Throughout the film, Kate Winslet's Rose is wearing bold, vivid red lipstick. It's striking. It suits her personality. It makes her look like someone who refuses to follow the rules. But from a historical accuracy standpoint, it's a significant misrepresentation of what upper-class women in 1912 would have worn. During that era, cosmetics like bold lipstick were strongly associated with performers, entertainers, and women who worked in social spaces that were considered improper by aristocratic standards. A wealthy, well-bred woman from an elite family would have been expected to maintain a natural, understated appearance in public. Wearing bright red lipstick would have been considered deeply inappropriate for someone in Rose's social position, potentially even scandalous. The widespread acceptance of red lipstick as a fashionable choice didn't really arrive until the 1920s, when cultural attitudes shifted dramatically. The filmmakers made a deliberate choice to give Rose that modern, rebellious visual edge, and it works beautifully as a storytelling device. But anyone familiar with the social customs of the early 20th century will immediately recognize that this particular detail belongs to a different decade entirely. Along similar lines, there's a dinner table scene that contains a piece of dialogue that sounds sharp and clever in the moment but falls apart under historical scrutiny. While dining with the ship's elite passengers, Rose makes a reference to Sigmund Freud and connects his theories about male psychology to the conversation at hand. It's a witty, cutting remark, and it lands perfectly in terms of characterization. The problem is that the specific ideas Rose is referencing hadn't been published yet at the time the Titanic sailed. Freud's work was still developing in 1912, and the particular theories she alludes to weren't part of public knowledge or popular conversation during that period. The writers essentially gave Rose a piece of cultural awareness that she couldn't have had in that specific historical moment. It's the kind of anachronism that slips in when screenwriters are more focused on building a character's personality than on verifying the precise timeline of intellectual history, and while it's a small detail, it does represent a noticeable bend in the film's commitment to authenticity. Now here's one that involves the very famous ending, and it's a continuity issue that emerges from the emotional core of the film. In the final moments before Jack slips away in the freezing water, there's a close-up of his face. In one shot, his face is wet and pale, but there's no frost or ice on his nose or around his nostrils. Then, in the very next shot taken from a slightly different angle, there's a visible clump of ice on his nose that wasn't there a moment before. The scene was almost certainly filmed across multiple days, with varying lighting conditions and different applications of makeup and special effects. At some point between different shooting sessions, the effects team added more frost to convey the severity of the cold, but they didn't match that detail consistently across every shot in the sequence. The result is that Jack's face appears to freeze in real time between two cuts, which is physically impossible even in the most extreme conditions. In a scene meant to feel utterly raw and painfully real, that inconsistency is a small but genuine distraction. While we're on the topic of things that didn't exist in 1912, let's talk about a moment involving the ship's officers during the chaos of the sinking. In several scenes set in low-light conditions as officers search the ship, they're using flashlights with a sharp, bright white beam. This is the kind of cold, intense light that we associate with modern LED or high-powered flashlights today. In 1912, however, handheld torches would have produced a much warmer, yellower, dimmer glow, consistent with the incandescent and carbon filament bulb technology of that era. These early electric torches were significantly less powerful than what's depicted in the film, and their light quality was much closer to a warm lantern than a focused modern beam. The production team almost certainly made this choice to ensure that the actors and sets were clearly visible on camera, and from a filmmaking standpoint that decision makes practical sense. But for viewers with any awareness of the technology available in the early 20th century, those blazing white flashlight beams are small but persistent anachronism hiding in the middle of an otherwise immersive experience. Let's talk about one of the most famous scenes in the entire movie, the sketching scene. Jack draws Rose. The finished artwork is revealed, and it becomes one of the most iconic images in 1990 cinema. But look closely at the drawing itself across the different shots in that sequence. When Jack begins drawing, the first mark he puts on the paper is a thick, heavy stroke. It's bold and visible, but when the finished sketch is revealed later in the scene, that initial heavy mark is completely absent. The drawing in its final form features delicate, fine lines with a much lighter and more refined quality than that first stroke suggested. The explanation is straightforward. The finished sketch was created ahead of time by a professional artist, and the drawing Jack appears to be doing in real time was a performance built around a pre-existing piece of artwork. The thick starter line was part of the acting, but it never made it into the actual drawing that was shown as the final product. It's a small seam in the illusion, but it's one of those things that becomes impossible to ignore once you've spotted it. Then there's a broader historical inconsistency worth exploring. The real Titanic had 4 smokestacks, but only 3 of them were actually functional. The 4th was primarily decorative, included largely because designers believed a ship with 4 stacks looked more powerful and impressive. In the film, all 4 smokestacks are treated as equally active and operational. For a production that went to extraordinary lengths to recreate the physical appearance of the ship, this is a detail that could have easily been represented more accurately. It speaks to the tension every filmmaker faces when deciding between historical precision and visual storytelling. For fully pumping stacks simply looks more dramatic on screen. Similarly, the real Titanic's interior spaces, particularly in the second and third class sections, were notably more modest than what the film depicts. Cameron made deliberate choices to enhance the visual grandeur of the ship throughout, creating a version of the Titanic that feels more like a floating palace than the historical vessel actually was in many of its less glamorous eras. One of the most charming historical errors in the entire film comes from a single line of dialogue. Early in the story, Jack references ice fishing on Lake Wissota as part of a story he tells Rose. It's a small, personal detail meant to establish his background and make him feel grounded and real. But Lake Wissota is a man-made reservoir in Wisconsin, and it wasn't created until a dam was built in 1917, 5 years after the Titanic sank. Before that construction, the lake simply didn't exist. Jack couldn't have ice fished on it, because there was no lake to fish on. It's entirely possible this was a simple oversight by the screenwriting team, or perhaps the name was chosen for how it sounded without anyone checking its actual history. Either way, it's one of those delightful little errors that historians and trivia enthusiasts have been bringing up ever since the film was released, and it's a reminder that even carefully crafted stories can contain details that don't hold up to a quick geography check. Finally, there's something broader that the film asks us to accept at its very foundation, something that becomes more curious the more you think about it. The entire romance between Jack and Rose depends on 2 people from completely separate class worlds being able to interact freely on a ship that was deliberately designed to prevent exactly that. The real Titanic was physically structured to keep its passenger classes separated. First-class areas had their own staircases, their own dining facilities, their own promenades, and their own lock gates separating them from the lower decks. Third-class passengers like Jack would not have had access to the upper decks under normal circumstances. The idea of Jack wandering through first-class spaces, attending parties, sketching wealthy women in their staterooms, and moving relatively freely through a ship that was architecturally built around social separation is a significant creative liberty. It makes for an extraordinary and deeply moving story. But the real Titanic was not a place where the class barriers dissolved so easily, and the love story at the heart of this film is, in many ways, a beautiful fantasy layered on top of a very rigid historical reality.